I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Just really put yourself in this mindset.
Okay.
You're walking past this sprawling concrete building. The heat radiating off of it is just intense. And inside, the noise is completely deafening. Like thousands of sewing machines firing like machine guns.
Right, a classic sweatshop image.
Exactly. You look closer and you see these young women. Some of them are barely teenagers. And they are packed shoulder to shoulder. They're working 10, maybe 12-hour shifts. The air is just thick with fabric dust.
Yeah, it's a brutal environment.
And the pay is like pennies on the dollar compared to what those exact clothes will sell for in some fancy mall. Now, if you are a compassionate human being, your very first instinct, your immediate gut reaction is probably this profound sense of injustice. You want to shut that building down right now.
Right. It is the most natural human response we have. I mean, when we see that kind of suffering, or when we perceive this massive power imbalance like wealthy corporations profiting off the extremely poor, our moral reflex just kicks in. We feel this urgent duty to intervene, to regulate it, and, if necessary, to just completely cut off the financial oxygen to that system to protect those vulnerable workers.
Which brings us to exactly where we are starting today. Welcome to the deep dive. Because today our mission is to take that very natural, very warm moral reflex and just run it through this massive 30-year economic puzzle.
And it is a puzzle that really challenges everything.
It does. We are going to look at a data set that takes everything you think you know about human rights, global trade, and the very definition of exploitation and just flips it completely upside down. We are looking at this landmark working paper. It's number 20383 from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
By the economists Rachel Heath and A. Mushfiq Mobarak.
Exactly. But to really understand the gravity of what these two researchers found, we can't just start with the spreadsheets, right? We have to start with a very real, very dark moment in recent history that forced this whole conversation onto the global stage.
Right.
We have to go back to April 24th, 2013. The Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh.
Yeah, Rana Plaza was, it was a catastrophic failure on literally every conceivable level. It was this 8-story commercial building in the Dhaka district, and it housed several independent garment factories, along with like some shops and a bank.
Right, it was mixed use.
Exactly. Now, structural cracks had actually been discovered the day before, so the bank and the shops, they evacuated their employees immediately, but the garment factory workers, they were ordered to return to the sewing machines.
Under threat of losing a month's pay, if I remember correctly.
Yes, they were essentially forced back in. And when that building collapsed, the human toll was just devastating. 1,127 workers were killed.
God, that is just horrific.
Thousands more were pulled from the rubble with, life-altering injuries. It stands as the deadliest garment factory disaster in modern history.
And the global reaction was like a shockwave. I mean, I remember seeing the footage on the news. You had major Western consumer groups instantly launching boycotts of the brands whose tags were found in the rubble.
Oh, absolutely.
You had international buyers canceling contracts overnight because they were terrified of the PR nightmare. You even had the U.S. government stepping in and actively suspending trade privileges for Bangladeshi garment exports.
The narrative was incredibly unified.
Right. The narrative from Western activists was basically, we, sitting in our comfortable homes, have a moral obligation to save these workers from greedy capital. Like, if we starve these unsafe factories of our money, we force them to close, and we end the exploitation.
And look, that logic makes perfect sense on the surface. I mean, it is driven by genuine, real sympathy. But this is where Heath and Mobarak's research steps in and just, it demands that we look past our own emotional outrage.
Because they spent years tracking this, right?
Decades, actually. They tracked microdata across decades in Bangladesh. And their findings force us to confront this deeply uncomfortable reality. I mean, what if the data proves that shutting down these factories, our righteous attempt to punish greedy corporations, actually sentences millions of young, impoverished girls to a lifetime of forced child marriage, early childbearing, and inescapable extreme poverty?
Okay, I really need to pause here, because that feels like a massive slap in the face.
It is a hard pivot, yeah.
It feels entirely counterintuitive. Are you seriously suggesting that the very factories we label as sweatshops, the exact institutions human rights groups have spent decades protesting, might secretly be the ultimate engine for women's liberation in a developing nation?
That is exactly what the data suggests.
I just struggle to even put those two concepts in the same sentence. How does a noisy, dusty, low-paying factory liberate anyone?
Well, to answer that, we have to completely remove our modern Western lens. Like, we cannot compare a job in a 1980s Bangladeshi garment factory to a middle-class office job in New York or London.
Right. You can't compare apples and oranges.
Exactly. We have to compare it to the reality those women were living in before the factories arrived. We have to look at the historical baseline.
Okay, let's paint that picture for the listener. What was life actually like for a woman in Bangladesh before the 1980s? Like, before the hum of the sewing machines took over the entire economy?
Economically speaking, women were practically invisible. The researchers looked really closely at the older generation in their control villages. So women who were over 50 years old at the time of the survey, which represents that pre-factory era,
Right.
their average completed education was 0.54 years.
Wait, 0.54 years. Half a year of school.
Barely half a year. That is barely enough time in a classroom to learn how to hold a pencil, let alone read a document or do basic math.
That is staggering.
And that lack of education was tied to these rigid, deeply entrenched patriarchal norms. The cultural expectation for literally a millennium was absolute. Girls and women stayed indoors.
Right, they're confined entirely to the domestic sphere.
Yes. The labor force participation rate for women was virtually zero. And because they were culturally prohibited from earning a wage, they were viewed within the household economy as pure financial liabilities.
Okay, let's just follow that brutal mathematical logic for a second.
Yeah.
If a family is living in extreme, grinding poverty like, where literally every single calorie of rice matters, and a daughter cannot legally or culturally bring any calories into the house, she becomes a massive burden.
She is an economic drain on the family. That's just the harsh reality of it.
But what does a family do with a financial burden they literally cannot afford to feed? They marry her off. As early as biologically possible, you arrange a marriage for your 12 or 13-year-old daughter, so she becomes her husband's financial problem.
Exactly. And that system seems like an unbreakable lock on a woman's destiny, right?
Yeah, how do you even begin to dismantle that?
Well, it was a lock that had held firm for centuries, but then the global economy basically introduced a key. In the early 1980s, the ready-made garment export industry in Bangladesh, you'll hear it abbreviated as RMG, was essentially non-existent.
Okay.
But over the next 30 years, it experienced an explosion that is almost unparalleled in modern economic history. The industry grew at a staggering, sustained rate of 17% every single year for 3 decades.
17% every year. I'm trying to visualize that kind of growth. And this doesn't even look like a curve on a graph. It looks like a vertical line.
It absolutely was.
We are talking about going from, what, maybe 40,000 workers in the entire country in 1983 to over 4 million workers by 2013.
Yes, over 4 million. But the sheer scale isn't even the most important part of the story. It's the demographics.
Right. Who is actually getting these jobs?
Precisely. Because 80% of those 4 million new factory workers were women.
8%.
Just think about what that means for the social fabric of the entire country. For the very first time in the recorded history of Bangladesh, millions of women were provided with a structural, large-scale opportunity to leave the domestic sphere and earn a significant income outside the home. The psychological shift this triggers is profound. Suddenly, a daughter is no longer just a mouth to feed or a dowry that you have to pay.
She actually possesses a tangible cash value in the marketplace. Her physical labor can directly support her parents and her siblings.
Exactly. You are talking about completely rewriting the economic equation of what it means to give birth to a girl.
If a daughter can suddenly pay for the family's food, her parents are going to treat her entirely differently.
Which brings us to the next massive puzzle piece in this paper. And this one is fascinating because it involves the government actively trying to take credit for a miracle.
Oh, I love this part. The paper dives deep into the educational gap between boys and girls, right?
Yes.
How does a country struggling with immense poverty manage to eliminate the gender gap in schooling? Because that doesn't just happen overnight.
The transformation in education is honestly just as dramatic as the rise of the factories. If you look at school enrollment data in Bangladesh from 1970 up through the 1980s, the trend is exactly what you would expect in a patriarchal society.
Boys go to school, girls stay home.
Exactly. The boys' enrollment line absolutely crushed the girls' enrollment line. The gap was wide and it was stubborn.
But then, if you look at the chart, and we're looking at the data from the NBER paper here, something wild happens. Sometime in the 1990s, the line tracking girls' school enrollment just starts climbing a wall.
It accelerates incredibly fast.
Right. So fast that by the late 90s, the two lines intersect. Girls violently overtake boys in secondary school enrollment. A poor developing nation just casually achieves educational gender parity decades ahead of schedule, while wealthy nations are still hosting global summits trying to figure out how to get girls into STEM.
It is an absolute anomaly.
So how on earth did that happen?
Well, if you ask the Bangladeshi government or the World Bank or any of the major international NGOs, they will all give you the exact same very proud answer. They will point you to a massive top-down policy intervention called the Female Secondary School Assistance Project.
Or the FSP, the Female Stipend Program. Let's dig into the FSP. Because on paper, I mean, it sounds like the ultimate progressive victory. We are talking about a massive government social engineering project launched in 1994, armed with $15 million a year in multilateral donor support.
That is a huge amount of money for that region.
Huge. And the mechanism was really simple, right? The government literally just paid cash to the families of 2 million girls on the condition that the girls stayed in secondary school and remained unmarried.
Correct.
And if you read the academic literature or the policy reviews from the early 2000s, this program gets 100% of the credit. The narrative was, look at the power of targeted government spending. We bought our way out of the gender gap.
It is a beautifully clean narrative. It validates the existence of international aid. It makes policymakers feel great. There is only one problem.
Here comes a slap in the face.
When researchers Heath and Mobarak actually overlaid the historical timeline matching the exact year, the girls' enrollment spiked against the exact year that $15 million stipend program began, the entire government myth just collapses.
Wait, what do the timelines actually show?
The steep exponential climb in female school enrollment did not start in 1994 when the government money started flowing. The surge actually began several years before the FSP even existed.
Okay, so the government basically just walked outside right as the sun was coming up, set off an alarm clock, and then called a press conference to take credit for raising the sun.
That is an incredibly apt analogy, yes. The government swooped in and launched this expensive stipend program during a massive pre-existing upward trend.
Wow.
Now, in fairness to the researchers, they didn't just eyeball a chart and call it a day. They had to rigorously prove that the government program was actually ineffective. And to do this, they used a statistical method called a triple difference strategy.
Okay, stop right there. Triple difference strategy sounds like something that requires a PhD to decipher. Break that down for us. What does that actually look like in practice?
Let's use another analogy. Imagine you invent a new fertilizer and you claim it makes corn grow twice as fast.
Okay.
If you just spray it on a field and the corn grows, you can't claim victory. Maybe it was just a really rainy, sunny year and all crops grew faster everywhere. That's just a simple before and after difference.
Right. You need a control group.
Exactly. So for a double difference, you spray your fertilizer on field A, but not on field B, and then you measure the difference in growth between the two over the same season. But what if field A just has naturally better soil?
Ah, okay. So how do we get to a triple difference?
You introduce a third layer of comparison. You take field A and field B, but in both fields, you plant two different types of crops, say corn and wheat. You only spray the fertilizer on the corn in field A. Now you are comparing the change in corn versus wheat, in field A versus field B, before and after the spraying.
I see. It completely isolates the exact effect of the fertilizer, stripping away the impact of the weather, the soil, and the natural growth rates of the plants.
Exactly. It's an incredibly robust way to isolate variables.
So how did Heath and Mobarak apply that triple difference to the girls in Bangladesh?
They compared girls who were eligible for the stipend to boys who were not eligible. That is one difference. They compared them before 1994 and after 1994. That is the second difference.
Got it.
And crucially, they compared them in villages that had garment factories versus villages that had 0 factories. That is the third difference.
And when they ran all those layers of data together, what happened to the heroic $15 million government program?
It practically vanished.
Hello?
When they mathematically controlled for the presence of the garment factories, the actual isolated net effect of the highly praised government stipend was basically 0.
0.
In some specific models, the coefficient was even slightly negative.
You are kidding.
Nope. The real driver, the massive invisible hand pulling millions of young girls out of the fields and into the classrooms, was the quiet, explosive spread of the garment industry.
I am really struggling to buy this. Like, I have to push back here.
Please do.
Because everything we are taught about global supply chains tells us that a sweatshop is looking for the absolute cheapest, most easily exploitable labor possible. They want a human robot. They want someone who can push a pedal or pull a lever for 12 hours without asking any questions.
Right.
Why on earth would a factory owner trying to maximize profit care if an 8-year-old girl down the street is currently sitting in a classroom learning to read? It makes no sense for the factory to desire educated workers for low-skill labor.
Your skepticism is entirely valid, and it points to a fundamental misunderstanding of how a modern, ready-made garment factory actually operates. The stereotype of mindless robotic labor is simply inaccurate.
Really?
Yes, these are not 19th century textile mills. A modern export factory demands basic, crucial cognitive skills from its floor workers.
What kind of skills? I mean, we are talking about sewing T-shirts.
We are, but the logistics of sewing those T-shirts at a massive global scale are complex. First, the workers are paid on a piece rate quota system.
Meaning they get paid per shirt they finish.
Exactly. This means a worker has to keep accurate, written records of her own daily production to ensure she isn't cheated out of her wages at the end of the month. She needs basic numeracy.
Oh, that makes sense.
Second, the fashion industry is incredibly volatile. You aren't sewing the exact same white shirt for 10 years straight. You might sew a winter coat one week and a summer dress the next. The workers have to be able to read and interpret new stitching schematics quickly without a floor supervisor holding their hand for hours.
So it's an assembly line, but it's a dynamic, constantly shifting assembly line. You adapt.
You have to adapt constantly. Furthermore, the production takes place in coordinated teams. If one person bottlenecks, the whole team loses money. This requires clear communication, basic conflict resolution, and on-the-fly logistical problem solving. In fact, the demand for these cognitive skills is so high that the researchers found some factories actively administer basic English and math tests to their applicants right at the factory gate.
Wait, they test them, so they're actively screening for literacy.
They are, and the demographic data reflects this preference perfectly. Look at the survey numbers. The average female garment worker in these villages has completed 6.0 years of education.
Okay.
Compare that to women in the exact same villages who do not work in the factories. They average only 4.1 years.
That's a big jump.
And if you look at women in isolated villages with no factories at all, the average drops to a dismal 3.2 years. The factories clearly act as a massive magnet for educated women.
But the factory being a magnet doesn't explain why a parent would suddenly decide to send their 5-year-old to school, unless the factory is actually paying a premium for that literacy.
Now you are hitting the core engine of the miracle. To prove this, the economists ran what is called a Mincer wage regression.
Okay, translation please. What is a Mincer wage regression?
Think of it like a highly detailed, itemized receipt for a human being's skills. It is an economic formula that strips away everything else and calculates the exact cold, hard cash value of one single year of sitting in a classroom.
And what was the price tag on a year of school in Bangladesh?
The receipt was very clear. Every single extra year of schooling a girl acquires gives her an automatic 3.7% bump in her future wages at the factory.
A 3.7% bump.
Yes. And perhaps more importantly, every extra year of school gives her a 2.1% higher probability of actually landing one of those coveted factory jobs in the first place rather than being turned away at the gate.
So the abstract concept of, education is good suddenly transforms into a highly lucrative financial asset. Put us in the mind of a father in rural Bangladesh in, say, 1988. Walk us through how this single data point completely upends his worldview.
Sure. So imagine you are an impoverished father. You are a subsistence farmer. You have a young daughter. For your entire life, tradition and economics have told you that she is a burden. You would normally pull her out of school, if you even let her start, and marry her off immediately because you just cannot afford the calories to keep her alive under your roof.
It's pure survival mode.
Exactly. But now, a massive concrete factory is built 3 miles down the road. It is noisy, it is crowded, but at the end of every single month, you see young women walking out of those gates with stacks of cash. Real, tangible wealth.
But you also notice that the factory manager at the gate is only hiring the girls who can read the production sheets.
Exactly. So what do? You sit down and you do the rational economic math. You keep your daughter in school. You scrape together whatever meager resources you have to invest in her primary education. Because for the first time in your family's history, you see a guaranteed high-yield return on that investment.
Wow.
The factory hasn't just offered a job, it has essentially placed a massive financial bounty on female literacy. And that bounty is infinitely more powerful at changing a father's mind than any government awareness campaign or, a UN billboard about girls' rights.
It makes complete logical sense. I mean, it is a brilliant economic incentive.
Yeah.
But I still have to play the skeptic here.
Go for it.
How do we know this entire narrative isn't just a massive lucky coincidence?
What do you mean by coincidence?
Correlation is not causation, right? You said the factories were built near these villages. Well, factories require heavy infrastructure. They require paved roads, reliable electricity, maybe a new bus line to transport goods.
Right.
What if the factory being built brought a new highway to the village? And what if that new highway just made it much easier and safer for everyone, both boys and girls, to walk to school? Or what if the factory just injected money into the local economy, the village got richer, and richer people naturally send their kids to school?
Ah, the wealth and infrastructure argument?
Exactly. How do we definitively prove that the demand for female labor caused the schooling spike, and not just general economic development from the roads?
That is the exact pushback every peer reviewer would give. And Heath and Mobarak anticipated it. Their methodology to eliminate every single one of those excuses is ruthless. They didn't rely on warm feelings or broad national correlations. They zoomed in and mapped it out with extreme precision.
How do they set up the map?
They surveyed 60 specific villages. They classified 44 of these villages as being within commuting distance of a garment factory.
Okay.
By commuting distance, they meant a young woman could realistically live at home with her parents and walk or take a short bus ride to the factory gates every morning. The other 16 villages were designated as the control group. They were located much further out in the rural countryside, completely isolated from the factory labor market.
Right. The data shows the factory villages were, on average, about 1.8 kilometers from the edge of the capital city, Dhaka. Meanwhile, the control villages were almost 7 kilometers away, so we have a clear geographical split. But that still doesn't solve my highway problem. A village 1.8 kilometers from the city is obviously going to have better roads and a wealthier local economy than a village 7 kilometers out.
You are absolutely right. If the factories just brought general wealth or better infrastructure, you would expect to see school enrollment rise equally for both boys and girls in those closer villages. A new road doesn't discriminate, right?
Right. It helps the son walk to school just as much as the daughter.
Exactly. So, to completely destroy the highway argument, the researchers deployed the ultimate econometric stress test. They used something called sibling fixed effects.
Sibling fixed effects. Okay, give me another analogy. How does this eliminate the background noise?
Think of it as the ultimate scientific control environment. Imagine you want to test the effect of a specific vitamin on human growth. If you give it to a kid in a rich neighborhood and compare him to a kid in a poor neighborhood who didn't get the vitamin, your data is garbage.
Because the rich kid has better food, better health care, less stress.
Exactly. There are too many variables. The perfect test would be identical twins living in the exact same house. You give one the vitamin and the other a placebo. Sibling fixed effects does exactly this with the data.
Oh, wow.
Instead of comparing a girl in a factory village to some random girl in a farming village miles away, the researchers compared a girl in a factory village directly to her own brother living in the exact same house.
That is brilliant. Okay, so they share the exact same parents. They eat from the exact same pot of rice. They walk out of the exact same front door onto the exact same dirt road. The wealth level of the household is identical.
100% identical.
The only variable that changes is their gender and therefore their future employability at the local garment factory.
Precisely. Every single environmental variable is held entirely constant. And when the researchers ran that sibling-to-sibling comparison, the results were undeniable. In families exposed to the garment industry, the girls gained an extra 1.5 years of completed education compared directly to their own brothers.
1.5 extra years, specifically targeted at the girls, inside the very same household.
Yes. To put the magnitude of that into perspective, that 1.5 years represents a massive 50% increase in educational attainment over the baseline gender gap observed in the isolated control villages.
Okay, that completely obliterates the highway argument. A paved road didn't make them go to school. The parents actively chose to invest their limited money into the daughter over the son, or at least equal to the son.
Yes, they did.
In a culture that had viewed girls as financially worthless for 1,000 years, that is a revolutionary shift in human behavior. It's almost poetic in a very brutal way. The raw, unguided, profit-hungry force of global trade achieved in a few short years what decades of moralizing UN decrees and government aid policies completely failed to do.
It did. But we cannot stop at education, because sitting in a classroom is just a metric. We have to look at what those extra 1.5 years in a classroom actually protected those girls from. We need to examine how a factory hiring flyer pasted on a wall became infinitely more powerful than the national laws against child marriage.
This is where the story gets deeply emotional. Let's talk about the marriage drop, because technically it is illegal to marry off young girls in Bangladesh. There are strict age of consent laws on the books.
There are,
But anyone who has studied development economics or sociology knows that national laws drafted in a capital city are incredibly hard to enforce in poor, remote, rural villages. A piece of paper in Dhaka doesn't stop a starving family from arranging a marriage for their 13-year-old daughter.
law enforcement in remote areas is weak, but economic reality is absolute. The researchers wanted to track exactly how the factories disrupted this deeply ingrained tradition, and they used a statistical tool called a discrete time hazard model.
Let's translate that. What is a hazard model?
Think of navigating life as a teenager in this society as walking across a minefield, where every step forward is another year of your life. The hazard is stepping on a landmine, which, in this context, is an arranged child marriage that immediately ends your education and your independence.
That's a vivid way to put it.
A discrete time hazard model calculates the exact mathematical probability of a girl stepping on that mine in any given year of her life.
And what did the model show when the factories was introduced into the minefield?
It showed that the factory essentially cleared the mines. For girls aged 12 to 18 living near a garment factory, the risk of early marriage plummeted by a staggering 28%.
A 28% drop in child marriage. Why? Like, how does sewing shirts literally stop a wedding?
Because it alters the opportunity cost. If a 14-year-old girl is married off, she immediately assumes the incredibly heavy burden of domestic servitude in her new husband's home. She is expected to cook, clean, manage the household, and most importantly, she is expected to start having children immediately. If she is doing all of that, she physically cannot work a 10 or 12-hour shift on the factory floor.
So the factory demands her time, but it pays her handsomely for it. If her parents marry her off, they immediately lose access to her monthly factory wages. The dowry they might save is dwarfed by the cash she can bring in.
Exactly.
So purely out of financial self-interest, they delay the marriage.
They delay the marriage, and that delay cascades into the next crucial metric, childbirth. The hazard model tracked this as well. The researchers found that the risk of a young woman having her first child at an early age dropped by an unbelievable 29%.
We really need to sit with the generational impact of that 29% drop. I mean, when we talk about having a child at 14 or 15 years old in a developing nation, we aren't just talking about a teenager having to grow up fast. We are talking about severe biological danger.
Absolutely. The health risks are enormous.
The maternal mortality rates for 14-year-olds are horrific. Their bodies are not fully developed. The infant mortality rates are equally terrible. By simply delaying that first birth until she is 18, 19, or 20, that young woman is drastically increasing her chances of physical survival.
She is protecting her life, but she is also breaking the economic cycle of poverty. Early childbirth locks a woman into a life of dependence. By delaying it, these young women are taking control of their own reproductive timelines, exercising bodily autonomy, simply because they finally have a viable financial alternative.
It is incredible. But the data doesn't just present this clean utopian narrative, right? It also forces us into a very complex and frankly very brutal dilemma.
It does.
If we look closely at the age-specific enrollment data in the paper, we see two vastly different stories playing out at the exact same time. It is what we might call the 9 versus 17 dilemma.
Yes. This is where the Western activist perspective clashes hardest with the economic reality on the ground. The data shows that the presence of the factories massively increases the likelihood that a 9-year-old girl will stay in school. But simultaneously, the presence of the factories actually makes a 17-year-old girl more likely to drop out of school.
And if you're a Western activist sitting in an air-conditioned office in London or New York, you look at a 17-year-old dropping out of high school to go work 12 hours a day in a dusty sweatshop, and you scream, "This is a profound failure. This is exactly the exploitation we are fighting against. We have to shut it down."
Which brings us to the most critical question of this deep dive. Why do we see this split? Why does the 5 to 9-year-old girl see a massive 7.6 percentage point increase in her likelihood of being enrolled in school, while the 17-year-old girl actually sees a slight decrease in her enrollment?
Yeah, what's driving that?
To understand this, we have to strip away our middle-class assumptions about what the trajectory of a teenager's life should look like and understand the precise, rational calculus of extreme poverty.
Okay, let's break down that calculus. Let's look at the 9-year-old first. At age 9, the girl is biologically too small and too weak to be useful on a grueling factory floor.
Right.
Furthermore, the factories themselves know that Western buyers are terrified of PR disasters. If a major brand is caught using literal 9-year-old child labor, they will face existential boycotts. So the factories actively refuse to hire 9-year-olds.
The parents know this. They know the 9-year-old cannot work yet. So what is the most profitable thing they can do with her time? They send her to school. They invest in her literacy and numeracy so that she is primed and ready to secure a premium job at the factory when she comes of age.
So for the young girl, the factory acts as a powerful magnet, pulling her into the classroom to prepare.
Yes. Now let's fast forward the clock 8 years. That same girl is now 17. She has completed several years of secondary school. She has acquired the necessary literacy. She can do basic math.
She checks all the boxes.
And she is physically capable of enduring the long hours. In the context of her harsh reality, the preparation phase is over. It is time to cash in on the investment. She drops out of secondary school, walks to the factory, and enters the labor force.
And this is where we have to reframe the emotional reality of her choice. To our listeners, a 17-year-old dropping out of high school sounds tragic. We assume she should be prepping for university entrance exams, discovering her passions, joining clubs.
But in 1990s rural Bangladesh, her alternative was not university. The alternative to the factory wasn't a college campus.
No, her alternative was an arranged child marriage to a much older man she had never met, followed by a lifetime of unpaid domestic servitude, isolation, and repeated dangerous early pregnancies.
Exactly.
So when she drops out of school to work 12 hours a day in a noisy, hot garment factory, she isn't becoming a victim. That factory door is her escape hatch. It is her golden ticket to independence.
It is the absolute best option in a menu of terrible options. And the data proves just how aggressively these women seize that option. The researchers specifically isolated the labor force participation rates for girls in the highest risk age bracket for arranged marriages, those between the ages of 10 and 23.
Okay.
They found that simply having a factory built within commuting distance of their village made these young women 17 percentage points more likely to work outside the home.
17 percentage points might not sound massive to a layperson, but mathematically, what does that represent against the baseline?
It represents a 79% explosion in female independence compared to the girls trapped in the isolated control villages.
A 79% explosion. That is a societal earthquake. It completely shatters the existing order. But you know what the most mind-bending data point of all is?
The intra-household data.
Yes. You don't even have to work in the factory to have your life completely saved by it. The paper outlines a ripple effect that alters the entire culture, even for those who never touch a sewing machine.
Yes, the intra-household data is perhaps the most profound and hopeful finding in the entire paper. Heath and Mobarak decided to look at specific households where neither the mother nor the older sister had ever worked in a garment factory.
So these are families that have literally never seen a single paycheck from the industry. They didn't get a sudden influx of wealth. They have no direct connection to the factory floor whatsoever.
Exactly. Yet, when the researchers looked at the youngest daughters in those specific unconnected households, they found that those youngest daughters still received a massive, statistically significant boost in their educational attainment compared to similar girls in the control group.
Okay, wait. Let me get this straight. If the family isn't any richer and no one in the house works at the factory, why is the traditional father suddenly sending his youngest girl to school?
Because the mere existence of the industry, the simple fact that the giant concrete building is standing a few miles down the road, changed what economists call the option value of a woman. It changed the psychological valuation of women in the culture at large.
Just knowing that the option of female economic independence exists fundamentally changes how a traditional father views his 5-year-old daughter.
Precisely.
He looks at her, and because the society around him is changing, he no longer just sees a future dowry he has to scrape together. He sees potential. He sees a future wage earner. He sees a human being with innate economic value, even if she never actually ends up taking the job.
The industry essentially rewrote the cultural DNA of the villages it touched. It provided undeniable, visible proof that a woman's place is not exclusively in the home. And once that idea takes root in the collective consciousness, it benefits every single girl in the village, regardless of whether her specific family participates in the labor market.
I want to make something incredibly clear before we wrap up this data. This isn't about cheering for capitalism or bashing government aid, right? We are talking about grueling, exhausting work. Working 10 to 12 hours in a noisy, dusty, high-pressure garments factory, worrying about building collapses and strict quotas, is a hard life.
It is extremely hard.
We are absolutely not romanticizing the labor itself. It is physically taxing. But we have to deeply respect the agency of these women. For them, that grueling labor is the currency they use to buy back their own destiny. They are sweating for their freedom from forced marriage and early childbirth, and the data shows definitively that they are winning that fight.
They're trading their physical labor for autonomy, for delayed marriage, for a smaller, healthier family size, and for a profound shift in how their society values them. Which brings us back to the ultimate showdown that we explored earlier.
The market versus the government.
Yes, we pitted two massive forces against each other, a $15 million a year, highly celebrated government social engineering project, the Female Stipend Program, against the raw, unguided force of global trade and the pursuit of cheap labor.
And when the dust settled and the researchers controlled for all the variables, the data is crystal clear. The global trade network won. It wasn't even close. The policy illusion of the government stipend shrinks to zero when you account for the absolute tidal wave of the garment industry.
And we must reiterate, for the sake of clarity, that this paper is not about taking political sides. Heath and Mobarak are simply proving an empirical, historical fact. The pursuit of profit across the global supply chain, driven by Western consumers demanding cheap T-shirts, unintentionally became the single greatest engine for women's education and delayed marriage in the history of Bangladesh.
Trade policy, completely by accident, ended up being the most effective education policy the country had ever seen.
Exactly. And that truth brings us back to you, the listener.
Let's turn this directly back to where we started this entire deep dive. Remember the moral outrage at the beginning. Think back to the Western activists, the politicians, the major buyers after the Rana Plaza tragedy, loudly demanding that we boycott, sanction, and shut down these sweatshops to protect the workers from exploitation.
We felt so incredibly righteous demanding that those factory doors be chained shut. It felt like the only moral choice.
But based on everything we have just unpacked for this incredibly detailed 30-year micro data set, we have to ask ourselves a very uncomfortable, very necessary question. A question that pits our warm, fuzzy moral instincts against the cold, hard, often brutal reality of development economics.
It is a question we cannot avoid.
When we sit in our comfortable homes, thousands of miles away, and demand the closure of these factories to satisfy our own sense of moral purity, are we actually saving these women? Or by cutting off the only mechanism that has ever given them power, are we just stripping away the only economic lifeline they've ever known?
If we successfully boycott the factory into bankruptcy, what happens to the 9-year-old girl whose father no longer has a reason to send her to school?
What happens to the 14-year-old girl who can no longer pay her own way and is immediately forced into an arranged marriage? Are we saving them from exploitation? Or are we actively pushing millions of young girls out of the classroom, out of the factory, and right back into the dark ages of extreme poverty and forced child marriage? It's a heavy, deeply conflicting reality, and it's something for you to deeply consider the next time you feel the urge to boycott or the next time you check the tag on your T-shirt. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.